At 3:45 in the morning on March 14, 1905, Isidore Davis saw an orange glare in the basement of 105 Allen Street on New York's Lower East Side. Davis lived in the building and operated a small winemaking business below it. The light was coming from the sink of a neighboring restaurant where a painter's funnel had caught fire. He pulled off his coat, tried to lift the burning object into the rear yard, and lost his grip when the flames ran across the fabric. He rushed upstairs, warned his wife and children, returned with a quilt, and tried again. The quilt ignited. Within minutes, smoke and fire were moving through the hallway above him. Somewhere in that 5-story tenement, the Moskowitz family was sleeping. Hers and Brana Moskowitz had arrived from Romania with their sons, Ben and Moise, and their 10-year-old daughter Haya, also called Ida. They had been in the United States for only 3 months and 10 days. The surviving records do not tell us who woke first, which door they opened, or which escape route they attempted. They preserve something more final. By morning, Ida was dead, and her impoverished parents were asking a Jewish burial society to help them bury their child. The fire itself was not especially large by the standards of New York. It became a 2-alarm blaze, the kind the city's professional fire department normally expected to control. Engines and a hook and ladder company arrived within minutes. But by then, flames had reached every floor. Roughly 150 people were inside the building. Men, women, and children crowded onto iron balconies, leaned from windows, or searched through smoke for the roof. Some jumped. Firefighters and police officers caught people in their arms, lowered children by ladders, and entered the burning structure to pull residents out. One officer carried a little girl through the building while his own clothing burned, then fell from a fire escape and positioned his body beneath hers as they struck the ground. He survived with fractures, burns, and internal injuries. About 20 people died, many of them children. 10 bodies were found together near the top floor beneath a roof opening that had been closed and locked. The exterior fire escapes were obstructed by boxes, rubbish, and boards. Openings that should have allowed residents to pass from one section to another had been sealed. The route to the roof, the last possible direction when the stairs filled with smoke, ended at a locked barrier. Most of the victims were discovered near the exits that had promised escape and delivered none. That is the detail to remember. The people at 105 Allen Street were not killed because New York had never heard of fire escapes. The building had fire escapes. They were not killed because the city had no inspectors. The building had been inspected, and its inspection records had repeatedly been marked satisfactory. They were not killed because nobody understood that roof doors should remain open or that iron balconies should be clear. Those rules already existed. The residents died inside a building that officially possessed the required safety features and had officially passed through the machinery of enforcement. So the real story is not that America once had absolutely no building rules. Colonial towns had restricted wooden chimneys and thatched roofs. 19th century cities passed ordinances after major fires. New York began requiring certain forms of emergency egress decades before the Allen Street disaster. But America had no uniform, modern system of building safety. What existed was a patchwork of local laws, special exceptions, overlapping departments, weak inspections, political compromises, and requirements that often looked much stronger on paper than they did inside an actual building. Safety was less a dependable system than a negotiation, and the people with the least money usually had the least power in that negotiation. To understand how a building like 105 Allen Street became possible, you have to understand what happened to American cities during the 19th century. New York's population grew from roughly 125,000 in 1820 to almost 1 million by 1870. Chicago grew from a frontier settlement into a commercial metropolis within a few decades. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Cleveland, and dozens of smaller industrial centers absorbed immigrants, rural workers, workshops, warehouses, factories, horses, railroads, gas lines, coal furnaces, and wooden housing faster than local governments could organize them. Every new worker needed somewhere to sleep. Every family needed rooms within walking distance of a dock, factory, laundry, shop, or construction site. Urban land became more valuable, particularly in crowded working-class districts. A landlord earned nothing from open space, wide courtyards, thick firewalls, generous staircases, or an empty passage reserved for emergencies. Those features consumed square footage without producing rent. Another bedroom produced rent. A rear building produced rent. An attic converted into sleeping space produced rent. A shop divided from a hallway by a cheap wooden partition. The arithmetic was simple: place more people on the same lot, spend as little as possible on construction, and collect weekly or monthly payments from every available room. The financial reward arrived immediately. The danger might not arrive for years, and when it did, the owner was rarely the person sleeping on the fifth floor. Older houses were divided into smaller apartments. Yards disappeared beneath rear tenements. Two-story wooden structures were raised to 3, 4, and 5 stories. Lots designed for 1 or 2 families came to hold 10 or 20. In the language of reformers, the buildings became packing boxes. Some were arranged back to back, with interior rooms receiving almost no sunlight or fresh air. Later designs included narrow shafts intended to improve ventilation, but those shafts could act like chimneys during a fire, carrying heat and flame from one floor to the next. New York investigators eventually described one common tenement plan as impossible to ventilate properly, impossible to light properly, and unsafe in case of fire. From the street, many buildings appeared solid. Their facades might be brick or stone, but behind the masonry were wooden joists, wooden floors, wooden stairs, wooden doors, wooden roof frames, wooden partitions, and rooms filled with bedding, clothing, paper, furniture, and fuel. Gas jets and kerosene lamps provided light. Coal or wood stoves provided heat and cooking. Basement shops stored paint, alcohol, oils, cloth, and other combustible materials. Small factories operated inside residential buildings. A fire could begin in a kitchen, workshop, stable, chimney, lamp, stove, or pile of oily rags and reach the only staircase before a sleeping family understood what was happening. The interior staircase was especially dangerous. In many tenements, it was not protected inside a fire-resistant enclosure. It connected each floor through a continuous vertical space. Once flames entered the hall, the staircase became the building's chimney. Smoke rose first, followed by heat and fire. Residents above the origin could open their apartment doors and discover that the normal route to the street had disappeared. This is why a second exit matters. It is not simply an extra staircase added for convenience. It is a recognition that the first route may fail. Modern safety design assumes failure. One exit may fill with smoke. One door may become blocked. One stairwell may be damaged. A firewall may contain flames but not smoke. A sprinkler may malfunction. A warning system may fail. Redundancy gives people another chance. 19th century landlords often saw redundancy differently. A second stair meant less rentable floor space, more construction material, more maintenance, and another route through which thieves might enter or tenants might leave unnoticed. Factory owners worried that unlocked doors would make it easier for workers to steal cloth or take unauthorized breaks. Theater managers disliked illuminated exit signs because they distracted from the performance. The same feature that protected life during the rare emergency created an ordinary expense every day. That conflict existed inside 105 Allen Street. The fire escapes were not empty emergency platforms waiting for disaster. In crowded tenement life, they were some of the only outdoor spaces available. Residents stored boxes there, dried bedding, tied clotheslines to the railings, sat outside during hot weather, and allowed children to play on the balconies. Jacob Rees observed that on suffocating summer nights, fire escapes became bedrooms because the apartments themselves felt like furnaces. A family occupying a few cramped rooms did not always have a private closet or storage area. The city ordered residents to keep the escape clear, but the building gave them nowhere else to put the objects of daily life. This did not excuse a blocked fire escape. It revealed why a rule directed only at tenant behavior could fail. The law required a clear route, while the building's design produced constant pressure to obstruct it. Inspectors could order boxes removed on Monday. By Friday, the same family might need the space again. The underlying problem was not that poor immigrants had some mysterious disregard for survival. It was that the building offered too little room for life and too few routes from death. New York had been warned long before the Allen Street fire. On February 2nd, 1860, flames broke out in the basement bakery of a tenement at 142 Elm Street. 24 families occupied the building. Fire department ladders could not reach beyond the 4th floor, and 10 women and children died. Public outrage pushed the state to pass an egress law requiring certain multifamily houses to have fireproof stairs or balconies. The Tenement House Act of 1867 later required fire escapes on existing and future tenements. But requiring something and obtaining it were two different achievements. Some landlords installed little more than iron ladders fixed against a wall. Others placed escapes only at the rear, inaccessible from half the apartments. Some structures had no fire escapes at all. In one later sample of nearly 2,900 tenements, almost 100 lacked any fire escape, while more than 650 had escapes only at the rear. Laws existed, but enforcement was slow, inconsistent, and vulnerable to pressure from property owners who resisted expensive alterations. The problem extended far beyond tenements. On the night of October 8, 1871, Chicago burned. The city had expanded at astonishing speed, using wood not only for houses, but for sidewalks, sheds, fences, warehouses, bridges, and streets. A dry summer had left the urban landscape ready to ignite. Strong winds drove fire through block after block. Roughly 300 people died. About 90,000 were left homeless, and an enormous portion of the city was destroyed. Chicago responded with stricter rules on construction in the Central District, but rebuilding began almost immediately, and enforcement remained a political struggle. Fire limits often protected valuable commercial areas first, while cheaper wooden construction continued beyond them. The city wanted safety, but it also wanted rapid growth. Builders wanted to replace lost structures before land values or business opportunities disappeared. Owners argued that masonry cost too much, workers needed shelter, merchants needed warehouses. The urgency to rebuild competed with the desire to rebuild safely, and urgency usually arrived carrying money. 1 year later, Boston suffered its own Great Fire. The commercial district contained impressive brick and stone buildings, but many had wooden interiors and highly combustible wooden mansard roofs. Streets were narrow, buildings stood close together, ladders could not reach the highest levels, and water pressure was inadequate in critical locations. The fire destroyed 776 buildings. Afterward, Boston strengthened building regulations, widened streets, changed insurance rules, and altered municipal finance. But once again, reform followed destruction rather than preventing it. These fires exposed another institution that shaped American safety: insurance. Fire insurance allowed owners to transfer part of the financial risk of destruction to a company. That was useful. Without insurance, one fire could ruin a merchant, homeowner, or lender. But insurance could also separate the person controlling a property from the full cost of losing it. If a building was insured near or above its market value, an owner might have less reason to spend heavily on prevention. In extreme cases, fire could become financially convenient. Insurance companies understood this problem because they were paying the claims. They began inspecting properties, classifying construction, raising premiums in dangerous districts, and refusing some risks entirely. They needed to know whether a building was brick or wood, how many stories it had, what business operated inside, how close it stood to neighboring structures where water lines ran, and how far firefighters would have to travel. This demand produced the great fire insurance maps associated with the Sanborn Map Company. Beginning in the 19th century, surveyors recorded the size, shape, materials, use, doors, windows, roofs, water supplies, and surrounding hazards of buildings in thousands of American communities. The small archival map that now looks decorative was originally a financial instrument. It allowed an underwriter in an office to see whether a block was a manageable risk or a row of connected fuel boxes waiting for a spark. Insurance companies also helped push technical standardization. Automatic sprinklers were appearing in factories and warehouses, but manufacturers used incompatible pipe sizes, fittings, and installation practices. In the 1890s, insurers and fire protection specialists began organizing common standards. The National Fire Protection Association emerged from meetings about sprinkler design, and the National Board of Fire Underwriters published a recommended National Building Code in 1905. It was a model rather than a federal law. Cities could adopt it, modify it, or ignore it. Still, it represented an important change. Experts were attempting to gather scattered lessons into a reusable system before every city had to discover them again through its own dead. But private insurance could not protect everyone. Insurers were primarily concerned with property losses. A warehouse full of valuable inventory might justify a careful inspection and an expensive sprinkler system. A crowded tenement occupied by families with little property did not always receive the same attention. The economic value of the building could be insured. The lives inside it could not be restored by paying a claim. Fire departments faced a similar limitation. American firefighting improved dramatically during the 19th century. Volunteer companies gave way to professional departments in major cities. Municipal water systems expanded. Steam-powered engines replaced hand pumps. Telegraph alarm boxes reduced reporting time. Better ladders, hoses, training, and eventually motorized apparatus made crews faster and more effective. Yet a fire department is the last layer of protection, not the first. Firefighters cannot create an exit after flames have reached the staircase. They cannot widen a hallway while hundreds of people are pressing toward a door. They cannot make a ladder reach a floor it was never designed to reach. They cannot easily enter a smoke-filled tenement when residents are already trapped behind locked roof openings and boarded fire escapes. At Allen Street, the elevated railway across the road reportedly interfered with firefighting operations. The building was crowded. The alarm was delayed. Wind pushed the flames. But those difficulties became deadly because the structure had no reliable internal path for evacuation. Firefighters were forced to perform rescues that the architecture should have made unnecessary. The city government responsible for preventing this outcome was divided among agencies. The fire department understood flame behavior and rescue. The building department handled construction rules. The health department worried about sanitation and disease. The police responded to immediate danger. The tenement house department inspected residential conditions. State legislators wrote some rules. City officials interpreted others, and courts could limit enforcement or delay penalties. When authority is fragmented, responsibility becomes easy to pass around. The building inspector says the fire escape existed. The tenement inspector says it was clear during the last visit. The owner says tenants blocked it afterward. The tenants say the apartments offered no storage. The fire department says the alarm arrived too late. The city says the law needs to be changed by the state. The state says the city already possesses enforcement power. Each statement can contain some truth, while the building remains dangerous. New York attempted a major correction with the Tenement House Act of 1901. The law imposed stronger requirements for light, ventilation, sanitation, courtyards, building dimensions, fire protection, and egress. It required improved stair-type fire escapes rather than simple vertical ladders in many situations. It created a specialized tenement house department with inspectors and records. Buildings constructed under the new standards became known as new law tenements, while earlier structures remained under older rules. The new department was not imaginary or entirely useless. During its first years, employees conducted hundreds of thousands of inspections, filed tens of thousands of violations, and compelled thousands of repairs. Dangerous rooms received windows, toilets and plumbing improved, Some rear tenements were removed. New construction became less dense and more carefully regulated. The reforms changed real lives. But the old housing stock did not vanish when the law passed. Tens of thousands of families still lived in pre-law and old law buildings, altering every staircase, shaft, roof opening, and fire escape required money, labor, access, and sustained enforcement. Owners sought exemptions, delayed repairs, challenged orders, or performed the cheapest modification that technically satisfied an inspector. Real estate interests pressured legislators to weaken requirements. Departments faced budget cuts and staff shortages. A law aimed at future buildings could not instantly remake a city already standing. Then came the fire at 105 Allen Street, 4 years after the celebrated Tenement House Act. The city had a specialized department. The building had inspection records. The fire escapes were present. The roof opening existed. And a 10-year-old girl who had been in America for barely 3 months still died beneath a system that had declared the property satisfactory. A coroner's jury found the landlord guilty of gross negligence for the locked roof openings and condemned the inspection failures of the tenement house department. Mayor George McClellan promised an investigation. Officials argued that inspectors ordered the escapes cleared, only for the obstructions to return. Blame moved from owner to tenant, from inspector to department, and from department to law. Beyond the verdicts and public statements, the larger system changed very little. That pattern was common. A disaster produced outrage. Officials promised action. A jury identified negligence. Newspapers printed photographs of bodies and burned stairways. A few individuals were charged. Then attention moved elsewhere. The political coalition dissolved and enforcement returned to its previous level. Sometimes, however, a fire was so visible that it changed the physical vocabulary of safety. On December 30th, 1903, more than 600 people died in Chicago's Iroquois Theatre. The building had been promoted as absolutely fireproof, but safety equipment was missing, incomplete, or ineffective. Exits were hidden behind curtains. Some doors were locked or difficult to operate. Others opened inward, so the force of a panicked crowd pressed them shut. There were no adequate illuminated exit signs, and the theater had opened before its safety arrangements were complete. After the Iroquois fire, theaters across the country were closed for inspection and alteration. Cities required clearer exits, outward opening doors, better fire curtains, occupancy controls, and hardware that people could release by pushing against it. What later became the panic bar emerged from a brutally simple observation. During an emergency, a door should work with the movement of a crowd, not require that crowd to step backward and pull. The reform was technical, but the principle was larger. Safety could not depend on calm, perfect behavior from frightened people. A building had to be designed for human beings as they actually behaved under stress. 8 years later, on March 25, 1911, fire swept through the Triangle Waste Company in New York. The factory occupied the upper floors of the Ash Building near Washington Square. Workers found exits obstructed, a fire escape collapsed, elevators failed under impossible demand, and one crucial door was believed to have been locked. In roughly half an hour, 146 people died, most of them young immigrant women and girls. Triangle became a turning point not because it was the first preventable workplace fire, but because reformers converted grief into political machinery. State Senator Robert Wagner and Assemblyman Alfred Smith helped establish the New York Factory Investigating Commission. Frances Perkins, who had witnessed the disaster from the street, participated in the reform movement and later became one of the most influential labor officials in the nation. The commission did not inspect only the burned factory. It investigated industries across New York State. Its members visited workplaces, took testimony from firefighters, engineers, workers, doctors, and owners, and examined how floor area, stair width, occupancy, machinery placement, fire drills, alarms, sprinklers, and locked doors affected survival. Investigators found factories where wooden partitions divided crowded rooms, machines narrowed the aisles, doors opened inward, fire pails were missing or misused, and the number of workers bore little relationship to the capacity of the exits. The Commission recommended a stronger Bureau of Fire Prevention, marked exits, compulsory drills, improved stairways, occupancy limits, automatic sprinklers in specified high-risk buildings, and an industrial code with the force of law. Dozens of measures were enacted. Employer groups protested that the rules were expensive, impractical, and likely to drive business out of the state. They were identifying the same trade-off that had shaped tenement construction. Safety consumed money and space, while the financial return from prevention was difficult to see on an ordinary day. What changed after these reforms was not that fire disappeared. What changed was the way buildings were expected to fail. Walls and floors were increasingly required to resist fire long enough for evacuation. Stairways were enclosed so that flames in one room would not immediately enter the escape route. Exits were separated so that a single fire could not block every path. Doors in crowded buildings opened in the direction people would travel. Locks could not prevent escape from the inside. Exit signs made routes visible through confusion and smoke. Occupancy limits connected the number of people in a room to the width and quantity of its exits. Sprinklers attacked a fire while it was still small. Alarm systems warned occupants before smoke reached them. Drills replaced improvisation with memory. A building code is, in plain language, a minimum set of rules describing how a structure must be designed, built, altered, occupied, and maintained. A fire code governs how the building is used after construction. Whether exits remain clear, alarms operate, hazardous materials are stored safely, and occupancy limits are respected. The distinction matters because a perfectly designed exit is useless when somebody locks it, blocks it, or fills the corridor with merchandise. Modern safety emerged from combining both ideas. Construction had to provide protection, and continuing inspection had to preserve it. Plans were reviewed before work began. Permits created records. Inspectors could examine hidden structural elements before walls were closed. Fire officials could return after the building opened. Violations carried penalties. Model codes allowed one city to use lessons learned in another instead of waiting for its own theater, factory, school, or tenement to burn. The system was still local. The United States did not create one federal building code governing every structure in the country. Municipalities and states adopted different versions of model codes, enforced them differently, and revised them at different speeds. Regional code organizations grew during the 20th century, and their standards eventually became more unified. But the American structure remained decentralized, reflecting the same tradition of local authority that had made earlier regulations so fragmented. Reform also left enormous gaps. Older buildings were often grandfathered under previous rules. Owners received years to make changes or avoided them entirely. Inspectors could still be overworked, underfunded, corrupt, politically pressured, or denied access. A fire escape could pass inspection 1 month and become obstructed the next. Poor tenants remained reluctant to complain when a complaint might lead to eviction. Landlords could postpone major work because unsafe housing was still housing, and families with few choices could not simply move into a safer building. Some reforms protected property more effectively than people. Some concentrated on commercial districts, while leaving residential neighborhoods exposed. Some made new construction safer, but did little for old tenements. Some were weakened when the memory of disaster faded. Even New York's Tenement House Department later reported that budget cuts and reduced inspections gave owners little incentive to improve deteriorating properties. And there was another uncomfortable consequence. Safety costs could be passed into rent, a requirement for wider stairs, more open space, masonry construction, plumbing, or sprinklers made buildings more expensive. Owners used that fact to oppose regulation, sometimes dishonestly, but the cost was real. Reformers had to confront a difficult question. How do you prevent cheap housing from becoming deadly without making decent housing unaffordable? The strongest reforms did not answer that question by pretending safety was free. They answered it by refusing to treat death as an acceptable discount. A narrow wooden stair was cheaper than an enclosed, fire-resistant one. A locked door was easier to supervise than an unlocked exit. A crowded floor produced more output than a floor with wide aisles. A rear tenement produced more rent than an open yard. The savings were measurable. The risk was pushed onto someone else. That is the economic heart of the story. Before effective codes, an owner could keep most of the benefit from cheap construction, while tenants, workers, firefighters, neighbors, insurers, charities, and city governments absorbed much of the cost when it failed. The market price of the room did not include the value of the missing exit. The rent did not fall each week because the roof door was locked. The factory's profit statement did not contain a line for the future lives lost at a blocked stairway. Insurance could price the building, but it could not fully price the child sleeping inside it. Fire departments could rescue people, but they could not replace safe design. Public outrage could punish someone afterward, but it could not reopen an exit during the fire. Building codes changed that calculation by making certain precautions non-negotiable. They forced the cost of a second route, a stronger wall, a wider stair, or an operating alarm into the cost of owning and using the building. They did not eliminate greed, negligence, corruption, or tragedy. They established a floor beneath which competition was no longer supposed to descend. For the Moskowitz family, that floor came too late. They arrived in New York believing that the crowded rooms of Allen Street were the beginning of a new life. 3 months and 10 days later, Hers and Brana had survived a fire and lost their 10-year-old daughter. The building had been inspected. The city had laws. The iron balconies were visible from the street. None of that created a usable path through the smoke. By daylight, officials could count the dead, photograph the ruins, examine the blocked fire escapes, unlock the roof, summon inspectors, question the landlord, and promise reform. But every important decision had already been made before the first flame appeared. It had been made when the building was divided, when the stairway was left vulnerable, when the escapes became storage, when the roof opening was locked, when an inspection became a mark on a form, and when the cost of correcting those conditions was treated as greater than the risk of leaving them alone. That is the precise historical lesson. Entire American cities did not burn because people in the past were too primitive to understand fire. They burned because fast growth rewarded speed, dense construction rewarded landlords, fragmented authority weakened enforcement, insurance protected property imperfectly, and the people exposed to the greatest danger had the least influence over the buildings around them. Modern codes are not evidence that danger was finally defeated. They are accumulated memory. Every required exit width, fire door, enclosed staircase, occupancy limit, sprinkler head, and illuminated sign carries the outline of an older disaster. The measurements look technical because grief was eventually translated into inches, materials, testing standards, and inspection schedules. Before that translation, safety was often an optional expense, and when a city allowed owners to save money by omitting it, the savings remained private, while the smoke, bodies, homelessness, and public cost belonged to everyone.